The lighthouse beyond the last map. On the ninth day at sea, the horizon acquired a light that should not have been there. It appeared shortly after supper, when the last of the sun had slipped beneath a bank of silver clouds, and the sea had taken on the soft gray-blue color of worn silk. Mara Venn was standing alone on the aft deck of the Caledonia, holding a cup of tea that had gone nearly cold. She had been watching the wake. There was something comforting about a ship's wake. It proved that you had come from somewhere, even when that somewhere had already vanished beyond the curve of the world. For 9 days, the Caledonia had been carrying 32 passengers and 14 crew members across the quiet northern reaches of the Pelorian Sea, following a route that few ships bothered with anymore. The vessel was small by modern standards. It had 2 passenger decks, a dining room with brass lamps fixed to the tables, a narrow lounge lined with blue velvet benches, and a promenade deck where people walked slow circles after meals. Its hull was painted dark green. Its smokestack was cream. Its captain claimed that the ship had been designed in an era when people still believed a vessel ought to look handsome from a distance. Mara had come aboard in Belhaven with 1 suitcase, a brown wool coat, 3 books she had not yet opened, and no particular desire to reach her destination quickly. That was why she had chosen the Caledonia. There were faster ways to cross the Pelorian Sea. There were ferries that made the journey in 3 days, and airships that could do it in 6 hours when the winds were favorable. But Mara had spent the last 11 years working in the municipal archive of Belhaven, where nearly everything was urgent for reasons that ceased to matter the following week. She had decided that, for once, she would travel slowly, and so she had spent 9 days eating breakfast beside strangers, watching gulls disappear one by one as the ship moved farther from land, and discovering that the sea had more moods than most people. That evening it was almost perfectly still. Mara raised her cup. Then she saw the light. At first she thought it was a star. It appeared low on the eastern horizon, pale and steady. Then it vanished. Mara waited. The light returned. It brightened gradually, held for several seconds, and faded again. She lowered her cup. A lighthouse. There was nothing particularly strange about a lighthouse, except that they were 400 miles from the nearest inhabited island. Mara looked toward the bridge. A figure was standing there behind the glass. A moment later, the door opened. First Officer Elias Vale stepped onto the bridge wing with binoculars in his hand. He was a tall man in his early 40s, with a face permanently browned by wind and sun, and the quiet manner of someone who had spent more time listening to weather than talking over other people. He lifted the binoculars. The light appeared again. Mara watched him become very still. Then he lowered the binoculars and went inside. Within 5 minutes, the ship had changed. Nothing dramatic happened. No alarm sounded. No one ran. But sailors appeared on deck. The engine notes softened. Captain Oren came out of the bridge wearing his heavy navy coat. Passengers began noticing. Mrs. Bell, who had spent most of the voyage knitting a green scarf of astonishing length, emerged from the lounge. Professor Hale came from the dining room with a napkin still tucked into his collar. A pair of honeymooners leaned over the starboard rail. The lighthouse shone again. A long, pale sweep. Then darkness. Then, after exactly 20 seconds, another. Mara heard Professor Hale say, "Well," he said it in the tone of a man who had discovered that reality had made a minor clerical error. Captain Oren walked to the rail. Mara approached him. "Captain?" He looked toward the horizon. "There isn't an island there," he said. Professor Hale had followed her. "Perhaps your chart is old." Oren glanced at him. "The chart was corrected in March." "Then perhaps the island is new." Islands generally require rather noticeable geological events before appearing in the middle of shipping lanes. Professor Hale considered this. "Fair point." The captain looked at Mara. "You worked with maritime records, didn't you?" "Among other things." "Old charts?" "Sometimes." "Ever seen anything marked out here?" Mara looked at the light. "No." That was not quite true. Something had stirred in her memory. Not an island, not exactly. A handwritten note in the margin of a chart. She could almost see it. But when she reached for the memory, it slipped away. The light swept across the horizon again. This time, for the briefest moment, it touched the Caledonia. The brass fittings along the deck flashed. The windows turned white. And Mara felt something peculiar. Not fear, recognition, as though somewhere, very far away, someone had opened a door and was waiting on the other side. The light passed. Captain Oren said quietly, "Reduce speed." From the bridge came the answering bell. The Caledonia slowed, and through the deepening evening, it began to turn toward the impossible light. They reached the island shortly before midnight. By then, nearly everyone aboard was awake. The sea had remained strangely calm, and a pale mist had gathered over the water. It was not thick enough to hide the stars, but it softened the horizon until sky and ocean seemed to meet without a boundary. The island appeared gradually. First there was a dark line, then cliffs, then the suggestion of trees, and finally the lighthouse itself. It stood on the western point of the island, rising from a low hill of grass. The tower was made of white stone. It was not especially tall, perhaps 70 feet, but there was an elegance to it. The tower narrowed gently as it rose, ending in a glass lantern room beneath a copper roof turned green by age. The light revolved slowly. Once every 20 seconds, its beam crossed the Caledonia. The island behind it seemed larger than Mara had expected. There were wooded hills in the interior, a crescent beach, and what looked like the roofs of several buildings near a small harbor. Captain Oren ordered the anchor dropped in deep water outside the bay. No one suggested going ashore that night. Whatever curiosity the lighthouse had awakened could wait until morning. The passengers remained on deck anyway. Mara stood beside Elias Val. "Beautiful," she said. He nodded. "That's what bothers me." She looked at him. "Beauty bothers you?" "Unexpected geography bothers me." That made her smile. He lowered the binoculars. "There's a harbor. I saw. And buildings. Occupied? No lights." They watched the lighthouse beam sweep over the water. "Except that one," Mara said. "Except that one." At midnight, Captain Oren finally persuaded the passengers to return inside. The dining room steward, Tomas, had made cocoa. People gathered around the tables in sweaters and robes, talking quietly. The mysterious island had transformed the passengers. For 9 days they had been polite strangers. Now they were companions in possession of a secret. Professor Hale spread a chart over one of the tables. Mara joined him. The chart showed nothing, just open sea, latitude, longitude, depth markings, currents, no island. "No mistake," Hale said. "Charts can contain mistakes. Not an island that size." Mara ran a finger across the paper. The position bothered her. She had seen it before. "Do you have older charts?" Hale looked up. "How old?" "Very." The professor smiled. "My cabin." 10 minutes later he returned carrying a leather tube. Professor Silas Hale was a retired historian of navigation, and he had apparently packed for his vacation as though expecting to be called upon to settle a boundary dispute between 18th century kingdoms. He produced 3 maps. The first was 60 years old. Nothing. The second was 140 years old. Nothing. The third had been printed 207 years earlier. Mara leaned closer. There. At almost exactly their position, someone had drawn a tiny circle in faded ink. Beside it were 4 handwritten words. She read them aloud. "Light beyond soundings, unconfirmed." Elias, who had joined them, frowned. "Soundings. The mapped waters," Hale said, "in older usage." Mara stared at the handwriting. Now she remembered. Years ago in the Belhaven archive she had cataloged the papers of a surveyor named Aldous Venn, her great-great-grandfather. She had seen those words before. Not on this map, on another. She looked at the professor. "Who made this notation?" Hale turned the chart toward the lamp. At the bottom of the margin was a faded initial. A.V. Mara sat back. "What is it?" Elias asked. She touched the initials. "My family." Morning came clear and blue. The island had not disappeared. Mara had half expected it to. Instead, she woke to sunlight coming through the porthole and the faint cries of unfamiliar seabirds. She dressed quickly and went on deck. The sight that greeted her was entirely different from the mysterious shape of the night before. The island was green. Not dark green, but the bright, wind-polished green of grass growing near salt water. Wildflowers covered the hillsides in yellow and white. Tall silver-leaf trees filled the interior valleys. Along the shore, the water was so clear that Mara could see pale stones several yards beneath the surface. The lighthouse stood in full sunlight. Its white walls were weathered but intact. Below it, a stone path curved toward a cluster of buildings beside the harbor. There were perhaps 12. A chapel, a long low house, Several smaller dwellings, a boathouse, and gardens, actual gardens. From the ship, Mara could see rows of something green growing behind stone walls. That, Elias said beside her, is impossible. She had not heard him approach. You're becoming repetitive. Plants don't maintain rows by themselves. Maybe someone lives here. We signaled. No answer? None. He handed her binoculars. Mara looked toward the lighthouse. The lantern was no longer shining. Then she noticed something. Laundry. A white cloth hung from a line beside one of the houses. It moved gently in the breeze. Elias, I saw it. At breakfast, Captain Oren announced that a shore party would investigate. He chose Elias, two sailors named Finn and Jose, Professor Hale, and Mara. Why me? Mara asked. Because your ancestor seems to have known the place existed. The captain buttered a piece of toast. And because if we find 200-year-old municipal paperwork, I want someone qualified to deal with it. Mara laughed. At 9 o'clock, they lowered a boat. The sea smelled clean and cold. As they rowed toward the harbor, the Caledonia grew smaller behind them. Mara watched the island. There was no movement, no smoke, no voices, only birds. The harbor entrance was marked by 2 stone pillars. On one was carved a sun, on the other a crescent moon. Inside, the water became perfectly calm. They tied the boat to a wooden pier. Elias stepped ashore first. Then he turned and offered Mara his hand. She took it. The wood beneath her feet was warm from the sun. They had arrived on an island that officially did not exist. And somewhere above them, hidden behind the glass of the lighthouse, something had been keeping watch. The village was empty, but it did not feel abandoned. That was the strangest part. Doors stood closed but unlocked. Windows were clean. The garden paths had been swept. In one courtyard, herbs grew in clay pots. Professor Hale picked a leaf. Mint. Finn looked around. Who's watering it? No one answered. They entered the long house. Inside was a kitchen. Copper pans hung above a stone hearth. Shelves held jars of flour, salt, dried beans, tea, and preserves. Mara touched one of the jars. No dust. A wooden table occupied the center of the room. 6 places had been set. 6, exactly the number of people in the shore party. Joe stared at them. I don't like that. Finn looked at the plates. I do. Why? There's bread. There was. A round loaf sat in the center of the table beneath a cloth. Elias lifted the cloth. The bread was fresh, still faintly warm. Professor Hale sat down. Professor, Elias said, if whoever prepared this meant us harm, they have chosen an unnecessarily elaborate method. He broke off a piece of bread. Also, I missed second breakfast. Mara laughed despite herself. Eventually they all sat. There was butter, honey, soft white cheese, apples, tea. The meal was simple and wonderful. Through the open window came the sound of the sea. For a while, no one spoke much. Then Mara noticed words carved into the table. She brushed away a crumb. Wait for the keeper. Finn stopped chewing. Well, he said, that's clear enough. Professor Hale leaned closer. Old carving. How old? Very. Elias stood. The lighthouse. They left the dishes where they were. The path climbed gradually through grass and flowers. Halfway up the hill, Mara stopped and looked back. The Caledonia rested beyond the harbor, small and dark against the brilliant water. For the first time she realized how far they were from everything familiar. There were no other ships, no smoke on the horizon, no aircraft, only ocean. The lighthouse door opened at Elias's touch. Inside, a spiral staircase climbed around the walls. The air smelled of stone, brass, and something faintly sweet, beeswax. They climbed. At the top, they entered the lantern room. The lens filled nearly half the space. It was enormous. Mara had seen lighthouse lenses in museums, but nothing quite like this. Concentric rings of glass surrounded a central lamp. Except there was no flame, no electric bulb, nothing that should have produced light. Professor Hale walked around it. How did it shine? Elias examined the mechanism. I have no idea. Mara looked toward the desk. A book lay open there. She approached it. The pages were covered in handwriting. The last entry had been made in dark blue ink. She read the date, then read it again. That's today. Everyone turned. Mara read the entry aloud. August 16th. Sea calm. Wind west by southwest. The passenger ship has arrived at last. Silence filled the lantern room. Below them, waves moved gently against the rocks. Mara turned the page. There was one more line. Mara Venn has come home. They returned to the Caledonia before noon. Captain Oren listened to their report without interrupting. When Mara finished, he looked at her for a long moment. You're certain? She placed the Lighthouse journal on the table. He read the entry. Then he closed the book. Lunch was unusually quiet. Soup, fresh rolls, roasted fish with lemon. Passengers kept looking toward Mara. Word had traveled. It always did on small ships. Afterward, she escaped to the promenade deck. Elias found her there. How are you? I'm not sure. Reasonable. They walked. The island remained off the starboard side. What do you know about Aldous Venn? Elias asked. Very little. Family stories? None. She leaned against the rail. He was a surveyor, born in Belhaven, worked for the Admiralty Chart Office, disappeared on an expedition when he was 39. At sea? Presumably. Body recovered? No. Ship? No. Elias looked toward the island. That seems relevant. I was thinking the same thing. That afternoon they returned. This time Captain Oren came with them. They searched the village carefully. In the chapel they found a wall covered with names, not graves, names. Each had a date beside it. Some were separated by decades, others by only a few years. At the bottom was an inscription. Those who found the light. Professor Hale counted. 112. Mara examined the dates. The oldest was nearly 4 centuries old. The newest was 28 years ago. People have been coming here, she said. From where? Oren asked. Hale looked around the chapel. Perhaps everywhere. Behind the chapel they found a path leading inland. It crossed a meadow and entered the silverleaf forest. The trees made a soft sound in the wind, almost like distant applause. After half a mile, the path reached a small cemetery. There were only 7 stones. Mara walked among them, then stopped. Aldous Venn, surveyor keeper of the Western Light, 1784 to 1856. She stood without speaking. Elias came beside her. He didn't disappear, she said. No, he stayed. Professor Hale found a stone bench. On it rested a metal box. Inside were papers sealed in waxed cloth. The first document was addressed, "To whoever bears my name when the light calls again." Mara sat on the bench. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter was not long. Aldous Venn wrote that he had discovered the island during a storm in 1823. His vessel had been damaged. The lighthouse had guided him through reefs and into the harbor. At that time, an old woman named Sarah was keeper. She told him the lighthouse was ancient even then. No one knew who had built the first tower. The island, she said, did not belong entirely to ordinary geography. It appeared only when its light was needed, not to save ships from storms. Not exactly. It appeared to people who had traveled so far from the lives they understood that they no longer knew what direction meant. Mara paused. Elias sat beside her. She continued. Aldous had remained on the island for 33 years. He repaired the village, tended the gardens, kept records, and maintained the light. But the light itself required no fuel. It shone when someone needed to find the island. Who? Captain Oren asked. Mara unfolded the final page. The answer was there. Not a name, a description. The keeper would know when it was time to leave, because the light would call someone connected to the island's history, someone who had spent years preserving other people's stories while neglecting her own. Mara stopped reading. Professor Hale quietly looked away. Elias said, "That's rather specific." Mara laughed. It came out half amused and half astonished. She read the final sentence. "When she comes, tell her this. The light has not waited for her because she owes it anything. It has waited because there is something here she may wish to remember." Mara lowered the page. "What am I supposed to remember?" A breeze moved through the silver trees, and from somewhere deeper in the forest came the clear sound of a bell, once, then again. They followed the sound. The path descended into a valley hidden from the sea. There they discovered the heart of the island, a lake. It was small and perfectly round, surrounded by tall grasses. At its center stood a stone arch. Nothing supported it, no wall, no building, just an arch rising from the water. A bronze bell hung beneath it. There was no rope, yet as the breeze crossed the lake, the bell sounded. Mara approached the shore. The water reflected the sky with impossible clarity. Then the surface changed. She saw Belhaven, not as it was now, as it had been when she was a child. Her mother's kitchen, summer light on the floor, her father singing badly while making coffee. Mara stared. Another image appeared, herself at 23, beginning work at the archive. Then 30, then 36. Years of rooms, shelves, documents, carefully preserved lives. She saw herself carrying boxes, cataloging photographs, repairing bindings. She had loved the work. She still did. But somewhere along the way, she had begun living as though her own life were merely the quiet interval between other people's stories. The water changed again. She saw Aldous, not clearly. A man standing beside the lighthouse. He was older than the portrait in the archive, gray-haired, sun-browned, smiling. Beside him stood other keepers, men and women, different centuries, different clothes. They were not ghosts. Mara understood that immediately. They were memories. The island remembered those who had cared for it. Aldous looked toward her, and though his lips did not move, Mara understood. You are not here to replace me. The image faded. The lake became ordinary water again. Mara stood very still. Elias waited behind her. Finally he asked, "What did you see?" "My life, good, most of it." He smiled. "That's better than many people manage." She looked at him. "And I think I understand." "The lighthouse?" "Part of it." They returned to the village as afternoon softened toward evening. And there, sitting at the kitchen table, was an old woman. She was drinking tea. Finn nearly dropped the basket he was carrying. The woman looked perhaps 80. Her hair was white and cut short. She wore a blue sweater and heavy boots. "You're late," she said. Captain Oren stared. "We've been here all day. I wasn't speaking to you." She looked at Mara. "Tea?" Mara sat. "Are you the keeper?" "At present." "What's your name?" "Eleanor Gray." Professor Hale immediately pulled out his notebook. Eleanor pointed at him. "No." He put it away. She poured tea for everyone. "How long have you been here?" Mara asked. 28 years. Mara remembered the chapel, the newest name. Eleanor Gray. "Yes, you came here 28 years ago." "I did." "How?" "Fishing boat." "You were a fisher?" "Accountant." Mara smiled. Eleanor smiled back. "Life is broad." They drank tea. Outside evening gathered over the harbor. Eventually Mara asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "Why did the lighthouse call me?" Eleanor stirred honey into her cup. "It didn't." Mara frowned. "The journal?" "The island called the ship. The lighthouse simply showed you where to go." "Why?" "Because I am leaving." The room became quiet. Eleanor looked toward the window. "I've been here long enough. You need another keeper. Eventually. And that's me. Only if you want it to be." Mara stared. Eleanor laughed. "Oh, you should see your face. Aldous made exactly the same one." "You knew him?" "No, but the island remembers." "Then what has the lighthouse been waiting for?" Eleanor set down her spoon. "You." "Why?" "Because Aldous asked it to." Mara looked toward the distant tower. Eleanor continued. "He had a daughter." Mara knew that. "Anne. He left her in Belhaven when she was 6. He never returned." "No. Why?" "At first because he couldn't. Then because he believed the island needed him. Later because too much time had passed and he was ashamed." Mara felt something tighten in her chest. "He abandoned her." "Yes." Eleanor did not soften the word. "He regretted it." "That doesn't change what he did." "No." The old woman looked at Mara kindly. "Regret rarely changes the past. It can only change what we leave for the future." She stood. "Come." They followed her to the lighthouse. The sun was setting when they reached the lantern room. Eleanor opened a compartment beneath the lens. Inside was a wooden box. She gave it to Mara. The box contained hundreds of letters, all addressed to Anne Venn. None had been sent. Mara touched the top envelope. "He wrote to her every year," Eleanor said. "Why didn't he send them?" "The island cannot be found by ordinary ships, and for many years no ship came." "None?" "Some, but never one going to Belhaven." Mara opened a letter. She read only a few lines. Aldous wrote about weather, birds, repairs, the garden. He asked whether Anne still liked pears. He wondered if she had married. He apologized, again and again. Some letters were only a page. Others were dozens. The last had been written when Aldous was 72. Mara held it carefully. "Anne died before he did," she said. "Yes. She never knew." "No." Mara looked at Eleanor. "Why show me?" "Because forgotten things are heavy." Outside, the first stars appeared. Eleanor touched the lighthouse lens. "The purpose of this place isn't to keep people here. It's to help things finish their journeys." The lamp began to glow. No flame appeared. Light simply gathered inside the glass. Mara watched it brighten. "How?" Eleanor shrugged. "I stopped asking in my 2nd year." The lens began to turn. Its beam crossed the sea. Far below, the Caledonia answered with a long blast of its horn. Eleanor smiled. "There." She looked at Mara. "Now the light has done what it promised Aldous. It brought me here." Yes. And now you decide what to carry away. The Caledonia remained anchored beside the island for 3 days. Captain Oren claimed this was necessary for navigational research. No one believed him. The passengers came ashore. The island welcomed them quietly. They walked the paths, swam in the clear bay, ate long lunches beneath the trees. Professor Hale spent hours in the chapel copying names. Mrs. Bell finished her green scarf and gave it to Eleanor, who protested that she already owned several scarves. Not this one, Mrs. Bell said. Children from 2 families aboard the ship discovered that the harbor was full of tiny blue crabs. Tomas brought flour and baked bread in the village kitchen. Someone found an old fiddle. Someone else knew 3 songs. On the second evening, they ate outside at long tables. There was fish grilled with herbs, potatoes roasted in coals, tomatoes from the island garden, bread, cheese, and a plum tart. Captain Oren declared the finest dessert he had eaten in 30 years at sea. Mara sat beside Elias. Above them, the lighthouse turned. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. She had been waiting for the question. "No," he nodded. She glanced at him. "You don't seem surprised. You spent 11 years in an archive. Meaning, you like civilization. I like hot baths." "Exactly," she laughed. Then she looked toward the lighthouse. "But I think I'll come back. Can you?" Eleanor says the island appears when it wishes. Convenient. Not especially. They ate quietly for a while. Then Elias said, "I'm glad you're not staying." Mara turned. He was looking at his plate. "Why?" He considered several answers. Apparently none satisfied him. Finally, he said, "I enjoy talking to you." It was such a simple sentence that Mara felt it more deeply than she expected. "I enjoy talking to you too." He looked up. "Good." That was all. It was enough. On the 3rd morning, Eleanor packed 1 suitcase. Mara found her outside the keeper's house. "You're coming with us?" "Of course. Where will you go?" "Belhaven first." "Why?" Eleanor smiled. "I've never seen it." "You've been on this island 28 years. Which is why I'm interested in almost everywhere." Together they walked to the lighthouse. The lamp was dark. "Who keeps it now?" Mara asked. "No one." "Won't it stop?" "No." "Then why does it need a keeper?" Eleanor considered. "Perhaps the keeper needs it." They climbed one last time. Morning sunlight filled the lantern room. Mara placed Aldous' letters into her bag. She had decided to take them to Belhaven. Not to hide them in an archive, to read them. Then, perhaps, to place them with Anne's papers so that the 2 halves of the family story could finally rest beside each other. On the desk lay the journal. The page with Mara's name was still open. Below the old entry, a new line had appeared. "The promise is complete." Mara touched the words. "Who writes these?" Eleanor was already descending the stairs. "No idea." Mara smiled. Some mysteries she was beginning to understand became smaller when solved. Others became larger. And perhaps that was not a failure. Perhaps wonder required a few locked doors. She closed the journal. Then she followed Eleanor down. The Caledonia sailed at noon. Everyone stood on deck. Eleanor stood beside Captain Oren on the bridge wing, wearing Mrs. Bell's enormous green scarf despite the warm weather. The engines turned slowly. The harbor receded. The white lighthouse remained visible above the hill. Mara leaned against the rail beside Elias. "Watch!" Eleanor called from above. "For what?" someone shouted. She only smiled. The ship passed between the stone pillars. Sun. Moon. Then the sea opened before them. Mara watched the island. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then a bank of mist moved across the water. It came gently. The lighthouse disappeared first, then the village, then the hills. The mist thinned. Behind it was empty sea. No island, no cliffs, no birds. Only blue water stretching to the horizon. Professor Hale removed his glasses. "Remarkable." Captain Oren said, "I'm going to have an unpleasant conversation with the chart office." Eleanor laughed. "Don't bother. An island cannot simply be omitted. It has managed quite well." The Caledonia continued west. By afternoon, the sea had grown slightly rougher. Nothing severe. Just long rolling swells that lifted the ship and lowered it again. Passengers returned to their ordinary habits. Cards appeared in the lounge. Mrs. Bell began another scarf. Tomas served tea at 4. Yet something had changed. People spoke more easily now. The island had given them a shared memory. That evening, Mara sat in the dining room with Elias and Eleanor. The meal was beef stew with carrots, fresh bread, and baked apples. Eleanor ate with extraordinary enthusiasm. "I haven't had beef in 12 years. "Why?" Elias asked. No cows. Reasonable. I tried keeping goats. What happened? They won. Mara laughed. After dinner, the three of them walked outside. The wind had softened. Stars covered the sky. Eleanor stood at the rail, staring west. Nervous? Mara asked. Terrified. It was the first time the old woman had sounded uncertain. 28 years is a long time. Yes. Do you regret leaving? Eleanor thought. No, but I already miss it. Mara understood. You could leave something willingly and still grieve it. They stood together. After a while, Elias went inside to begin his watch. Mara remained with Eleanor. Who were you before? She asked. Before the island? Yes. Eleanor smiled. A woman who thought she had missed her life. What happened? My husband died young. We had planned everything together. House, travel, children eventually. Then suddenly the plans belonged to no one. Mara said nothing. I spent 6 years going to work and coming home. One summer my brother convinced me to join him on a fishing trip. A storm blew us far off course. And you found the island. It found us. Did your brother stay? No. He went home. You stayed for 28 years. Why? Eleanor watched the dark water. Because for the first time after my husband died, I wanted to see what happened tomorrow. The ship moved beneath the stars. Mara slipped her arm through Eleanor's. The older woman leaned gently against her. After a while, Eleanor said, and now I want to see what happens tomorrow somewhere else. Days passed. The impossible island became a memory with surprising speed. The Caledonia entered warmer waters. The sky changed. Seabirds returned. On the 12th morning, they passed a merchant vessel traveling east. The two ships exchanged horns. On the 13th, rain fell for several hours. Mara sat in the lounge reading Aldous' letters. She did not read them all. Not yet. One was enough for a morning, sometimes two. Through them, Aldous became less like an ancestor and more like a flawed, ordinary man. He was funny. He disliked turnips. He loved thunderstorms. He worried constantly about money, even though he barely used it. He remembered his daughter's birthday every year. He regretted staying. He also loved the island. Both things could be true. Mara found comfort in that. Human lives rarely arrange themselves into clean categories. People could be loving and cowardly, generous and selfish, wise in one season and foolish in another. Perhaps archives sometimes made lives look tidier than they had actually been. Paper preserved decisions. It did not always preserve hesitation. One afternoon, Elias joined her. Letter? She nodded. Good one? Sad. He sat opposite. Do you want company? Yes. So he stayed. He did not ask her to explain. That, Mara discovered, was one of the things she liked about him. They sat beside the window while rain moved across the glass. Eventually, Thomas brought tea. Elias told her about his first voyage at 17. Mara told him about getting locked overnight in the Belhaven archive because a caretaker had forgotten she was working in the basement. How long? 9 hours. What did you do? Catalog shipping manifests. You didn't try to escape? I did for 20 minutes. And then? I had work. Elias stared at her. You're an alarming woman. So I've been told. By the time the rain stopped, they were still talking. On the 14th day, land appeared. Not mysterious land. Ordinary, charted, officially recognized land. The mountains of the western coast rose blue-gray above the horizon. Passengers gathered at the rail. Eleanor stood very still. Mara watched her. First mainland in 28 years. Yes. How does it feel? Crowded. They were still 20 miles offshore. Mara smiled. By afternoon, fishing boats surrounded them. Houses appeared along the coast. Roads, fields, church towers, smoke. The signs of thousands of lives happening at once. Eleanor watched everything. A tractor in a field fascinated her. So did a billboard. When a small airplane crossed overhead, she waved. It did not wave back. Rude, she said. That evening, the Caledonia entered the harbor of Port Aurelia. The voyage was nearly over. Passengers packed. Suitcases appeared in corridors. People exchanged addresses. Mrs. Bell cried while saying goodbye to several people she had barely spoken to before the island. Professor Hale promised Captain Oren a 40-page report. The captain begged him not to. Mara stood at the bow as city lights spread along the shore. Elias joined her. So, he said, so, what happens when we arrive? I take Eleanor to Belhaven. After that, I don't know, he nodded. And you, 3 weeks ashore. Then, another voyage. Mara looked at him. Do you always know what's next? Usually. Is that comforting? Usually. She smiled. Below them, dark water folded away from the hull. Maybe I don't want to know yet. Elias leaned against the rail. That can be comforting, too. They watched the harbor approach. After a while, he said, "There's a small restaurant in Port Aurelia near the old customs house." "Is there? Good soup?" "That's persuasive." "I was hoping it might be." "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow." The city grew brighter. Behind them, somewhere beyond hundreds of miles of open sea, there was an island no chart acknowledged. Mara wondered whether its lighthouse was dark now. She thought it probably was. Waiting. Not impatiently. The sea was good at waiting. Months later in Belhaven, Mara placed the final letter into a new archive box. On one side were the papers of Aldous Venn. On the other were those of his daughter Anne. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, their stories occupied the same shelf. Mara closed the box. She did not feel that this repaired anything. That was not what history did. History could not change what had happened, but it could make room for the whole truth. That seemed worthwhile. She switched off the archive lamp and went upstairs. Outside, spring had arrived. Belhaven smelled of salt, warm stone, and flowering trees. Eleanor had taken an apartment overlooking the harbor. She had joined a gardening club, abandoned it after 2 meetings, learned to use a telephone, developed an alarming fondness for cinema, and announced plans to visit 3 countries before winter. Elias had returned from his next voyage the previous evening. He was waiting across the street. Mara saw him and smiled. He lifted a hand. She crossed to him. "Finished?" he asked. "For today." They walked toward the harbor. The evening was warm. Restaurants had opened their windows. People sat outside talking over plates and glasses. Somewhere a musician played a slow tune on a violin. At the end of the street, the sea shone between buildings. Mara had changed jobs, not dramatically. She still worked at the archive, but 4 days a week instead of 6. She had begun traveling, small trips, nearby islands, coastal towns, places she had spent years reading about without visiting. Sometimes Elias came, sometimes Eleanor, sometimes Mara went alone. On her desk at home she kept a blank chart. The Pelorian Sea occupied most of it. In the place where the island should have been, she had made no mark. She had considered drawing one. Eventually she decided against it. Some places were not meant to be located, only found. That summer a package arrived at the archive. There was no return address. Inside was a small book bound in blue cloth. Mara opened it. Most of the pages were blank. Only the first contained writing. "The western light is quiet. The eastern light has awakened." Mara read the words twice. Then she laughed. Not because she understood, because she didn't. She carried the book to the window. Far beyond Belhaven Harbor, sunlight moved across the sea. Ships came and went, fishing boats, cargo vessels, passenger steamers. Each followed lines drawn carefully across official charts. But beyond those lines were older currents, forgotten harbors, islands that appeared only when needed, lights that waited without hurry. Mara no longer felt the need to explain them. Years later, she would sometimes dream of the island, not of its mystery, not even of the lighthouse. She dreamed of breakfast in the long kitchen, warm bread, honey, an open window, the sound of waves beyond the garden. She dreamed of the silver trees moving in the wind and of Eleanor laughing beneath Mrs. Bell's ridiculous green scarf. She dreamed of standing in the lantern room while evening gathered over an empty sea. In those dreams, the light always began the same way. A faint glow, then warmth, then a widening brightness gathering inside the glass without flame or electricity. The great lens would begin to turn. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a ship would be traveling through quiet water. Perhaps its passengers were tired. Perhaps one of them had reached a point in life where all the familiar maps seemed inadequate. Perhaps someone stood alone on a deck with a cup of cooling tea, watching the horizon without knowing what they hoped to find. Then the beam would sweep across the sea, once, darkness. 20 seconds, again, and far away, someone would look up. Years after her voyage on the Caledonia, Mara understood what Aldous had meant when he wrote that the lighthouse did not rescue ships. Ships usually knew where they were going. People were different. People could follow every correct route and still discover that they had traveled beyond the edges of the life they had imagined. And sometimes when that happened, there was no need to turn back. Sometimes there was simply another light, another shore, another table already set, another morning waiting beyond the last map.